Hola a todos, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos, buenas tardes. Queremos dar la bienvenida a una sesión más del Seminario de Tradición Sobrenatural. Yo soy Adriana Guillén y hoy tengo el enorme placer, realmente enorme el placer de presentar al doctor Simon Young, que nos acompaña hoy para hablarnos de un tema apasionante que son el oso sobrenatural social en Europa, Bohyni, hadas y nereidas. Les platico un poco del doctor Simon Young. El doctor Simon Young es un historiador, especialista en la tradición oral británica. Ha escrito numerosos artículos acerca de lo sobrenatural en el siglo XIX. En 2022 publicó los libros The Boggart's Source Book y The Nail in the Skull and Other Victorian Urban Legends. Es el editor de la obra Exeter New Approaches to Legends, Folklore and Popular Legends y enseña historia en la Universidad de Virginia, Campus Siena. También ha impartido cursos sobre historia del cristianismo, historia de la comida italiana, historia italiana contemporánea, la Segunda Guerra Mundial en Italia y el Renacimiento italiano. El doctor Simon Young también es muy generoso con su trabajo y pueden encontrar gran parte de sus artículos y libros en academia.edu. En un momento les compartiré el link a través del chat. Y también les pido por favor que estén muy pendientes de nuestro chat porque también les compartiremos información importante en referencia con la plática de hoy. Y también no se olviden de dejar sus preguntas, las pueden dejar las preguntas en el chat y nosotros se las comunicaremos al doctor Simon Young y pueden ser tanto en inglés como en español. Simon, we're so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for accepting having this talk with us.
Okay, Adriana, well, first of all, thanks very much to Claudia, and also thanks very much to Adriana for the pleasure of coming to speak to you tonight. I say tonight because here in Italy, where I'm based, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. So this is, but it's always an enormous pleasure to talk about fairies and fairy lore, one of my very favorite subjects, and the social supernatural, which is this term to describe supernatural beings that live in societies throughout Europe. Now, what I want to do today is break down my talk into 4 parts. The first part, I'm just going to speak really about how I became interested in this subject, and again, give a slight overview of what I mean by the social supernatural. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to look at the way that folklore writers have used the term social supernatural over the best part of the past 150 years. So not in tradition, but actually as an instrument to understand tradition. And then in the third part of the talk, I'll speak about how I would personally prefer to define the social supernatural and look at some of the features of the social supernatural, particularly in comparison with the solitary supernatural, which is this kind of binary pairing that we have in so many folklore traditions. And then in the final part, I'll use a few PowerPoint images and I'll talk, depending on the time we have, to 2, 3, or maybe even 4 case studies. I'll just see how we're doing for time. Okay, so let me start then right at the beginning with the question of what the social supernatural is. What do I mean by this? And what do folklore writers mean by the social supernatural? So I'll use this as part 1. And as we go through, Adriana has very kindly agreed to just put some of the terms or things I'll be talking about in the chat. So I understand, of course, that many people listening tonight are not mother tongue English speakers, and maybe this will help a little bit as we go along. So when we talk about the social supernatural, we're referring to supernatural beings that have a society, that live in a community and that live together. The typical model that you find in the European social supernatural is that you have, in a pre-industrial society, the village, you have the mountain, and on the other side of the mountain, or sometimes under the mountain, you have the community, this supernatural community that is a kind of a mirror that is held up to humanity. And in that wonderful way that the supernatural has, this is not a conventional mirror, the kind that we find in our bathroom or bedroom. It's more like a fairy mirror or a circus mirror, or the kind of mirror you would find in a fairy ground, where the fat becomes thin, the short becomes tall, and such like. I've long been interested in one part of the social supernatural, the British supernatural that has fairies and fairy lore at its centre. And really, I've published a lot on this area, but I've had the ambition to look outside Britain and look at other folklore traditions for several years. And particularly in the past 2 years with my colleague, Davide Ermacora, an Italian folklorist, I've set about writing a book with a number of scholars. This will be an edited volume. And both I and Davide are very excited at the moment because the book is finished in manuscript form, and we hope very much to publish it in 2023. And the book is entitled The Exeter Companion to Fairies and Other Social Supernatural Beings, European Traditions. And I'll talk a little bit more about this book at the end of the talk. But what we were lucky enough to be able to do was to find 16 European scholars who covered different parts of the continent in the book, to look at the question of whether the social supernatural was really an interesting term, a useful term, let's say, to use. And these chapters range from Ireland through the Iberian Peninsula, Scandinavia, and they go all the way to the east, to Ukraine, to the Baltic, and down through the Balkans, and also to Greece and the Hungarian-speaking parts of Europe. And again, the reason I pushed for this book was I wanted to try and understand whether the social supernatural system I was familiar with from English-speaking Britain was also duplicated across the continent. Okay, well, so much for an introduction. What I'd like to do now is just speak for a minute or two about the way that the social supernatural has been used by folklore writers through the generations. And again, I'm not talking here about what we have in folklore tradition, but the instruments that folklorists have tried to use to understand tradition. Now, it's perhaps surprising, but maybe it shouldn't be, that the first references we get among folklore writers to the social supernatural come from Ireland. And I'll justify these comments a little bit later. But already when folklore writing begins in Ireland in the early 19th century, back even in the 1820s with the great Thomas Crofton Croker, there's an effort to categorize social supernatural beings. And these beings, already implicitly in the way they're categorized, we see that there's an understanding that there's a difference between the social, which in Irish context, in Gaelic would be the she, and these various small solitary supernatural beings. However, it's for the first time in 1870 in a very obscure work by an Irishman, John O'Hanlon, Irish Folklore, where O'Hanlon for the first time uses these labels. O'Hanlon publishes under the pen name Laginiensis, which refers to one of the 4 provinces of Ireland. And in the book, John O'Hanlon refers frequently to the social supernatural, by which he means the Irish fairies, but also what he calls solitary fairies, which are other supernatural beings, but supernatural beings that do not live in a society. Now, I am probably one of 30 or 40 people alive today who has actually read John O'Hanlon. O'Hanlon is a very obscure writer, but he becomes important because he's read by authors who are far more influential. And the most important of these is an Irish writer, W.B. Yeats. Many of you will know the name W.B. Yeats. I'm a huge fan of Yeats, and for me, Yeats is the greatest Irish writer of the last half millennium, perhaps even of the last millennium. He was an extraordinary individual and also one of the great writers of poetry in English of the last century or 150 years. W.B. Yeats was fascinated by fairy lore, and he was a great believer in fairies. In fact, Yeats claimed that he had met one of the Irish fairy queens in a cave on the west coast of Ireland. And so he wrote with this great passion and also great belief. And in the 1880s and the 1890s, Yeats published 2 volumes on Irish fairy lore. And these volumes are miscellanies. Yeats, in terms of folklore, is not a particularly original thinker. But he was bringing together sources and putting them out there in a very useful way. And these books were bought by many people in Ireland and beyond. And in these books, Yeats frequently makes the division between the solitary supernatural or solitary fairies and what he calls either the social fairies or, and this is an English phrase I should have included in the chat, the trooping fairies, which means bands of fairies together. Now, Yeats, as I said, was influential, and this division started at this point. We're at the turn of the 19th, 20th century to spread outside of Ireland. It travels first across the waves to Scotland. Scotland and Ireland are linked together in folklore and indeed in cultural terms, at least the Highlands of Scotland, where Gaelic was spoken, and some Scottish folklorists began to pick up and use this form of division in their writing. However, the division also spread to the south across the border to England. And around the time of the Great War, a very promising young British writer named Catherine Briggs fell in love with W.B. Yeats's writing, and she read Yeats obsessively. And Catherine Briggs, as many of you will know, went on in the post-war period in late middle age to become Britain's perhaps most important folklorist of that generation, certainly Britain's most important fairyist. And in her writing, she consistently, I say consistently, she frequently uses this division between social fairies and solitary fairies. And if any of you are interested in this, we have at the moment on archive.org, a free copy of her Fairy Encyclopedia from 1976, which is absolutely based on this essential division. It's something you can just download for free there, and is well worth having. Yeats's influence seemed also to spread to the north of Europe, to Scandinavia. Carl Wilhelm von Sydow, the greatest Scandinavian folklorist of the pre-Great War or the interwar period, in 1930 used this fundamental division between the solitary and the social supernatural in his writing. And it was only used in one article, and then also it passed over into some of his other writings, but it was focused particularly in one article. But von Sydow was so influential that the next generation and his disciples began to pick up this division. And perhaps the most important of these was a young German woman, Elizabeth Hartmann, who would write what became the greatest work on trollology or troll lore, the social supernatural of the North. And from there, the idea also fed outside what is strictly Scandinavia into Finland, where that great Finnish folklorist Martti Havio picks up the distinction in his work on house spirits and supernatural helpers in the house. Now, von Sydow, we have no proof that he got this idea from Yeats, but von Sydow, there's this very strong link between Ireland and Scandinavia in the interwar period in terms of folklore, and von Sydow presumably picked up the idea from there. Von Sydow had lived in Ireland now, but he'd visited Ireland for months and months, and he was actually fluent in Gaelic. It is simply inconceivable that he had not read Yeats. So what happens to this idea? Well, it dies. The idea of the social supernatural ceases to be important in the second half of the 20th century. You still find it in places, and Catherine Briggs in England is perhaps the person who carries the idea forward most forcefully. Why does it die? In the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a division in supernatural writers in Europe about the way to categorize the supernatural. And I'm going to use terms that Michael Ostling came up with. Michael Ostling speaks of what he calls splitters and lumpers. Splitters are those that divide the supernatural into tiny pieces. These are the kind of people like Catherine Briggs, who write fairy dictionaries and fairy encyclopedias, where every word is given a definition like a medieval bestiary. And lumpers are those on the opposite extreme. They say, no, the supernatural doesn't exist. It's all in our imagination. And therefore, it's impossible to break it down into categories. We just have this lump of chaotic magic or magical imagination at the center of this. And it's useless to try and create categories that just break down on examination. I should say straight away that I am neither a splitter nor a lumper. And I, particularly with lumpers, many of whom are extraordinarily intelligent people, I simply cannot understand how you can come into contact with a living supernatural system and believe this nonsense. There is absolutely no question that the supernatural does break down into categories in the popular imagination. And I think the best way to look at this is to look at folk taxonomies in a given community. If we have enough evidence, and if we don't, as often happens for the medieval or the classical period, then perhaps the best thing we can do is fall to using typological categories. Splitters and lumpers, though, were both hostile to this social versus solitary division. Lumpers because they believe there is no difference in category, and splitters because they had this very flat system like a medieval bestiary. They didn't believe in multiple taxes, multiple categories that are very much there in folklore systems, in dialect, in folklore taxonomy, folk taxonomy, I should say, excuse me. So Davide and I, this is Davide Ermacora, my colleague in this volume, wanted to see if we could bring this idea back to life. And we wanted really to stress test the idea. We wanted to see to what extent this idea worked. Where I grew up in the north of England, the idea of the solitary versus the social supernatural is there in the folk taxonomy itself. It's absolutely fundamental, and it's very useful for looking at these questions. But does it work in other contexts in Europe? This was the question that we set ourselves. And we also tried to create a model of what the social supernatural is in our mind. We came up with 6 criteria, and here I'm going to move into part 3, and perhaps Adriana could even put these 6 points in the Facebook chat, just so you've got them all there in front of you. But what would we say are the characteristics of the social supernatural? Well, clearly not all systems use all 6 of these points, but we found that some did, and I'll go through these now. The first and the fundamental point is, one of the fundamental points, is that social supernatural beings are human-like. They're very, very close to human forms. There are many stories from around Europe of a human being encountering a social supernatural being, be it a fairy or some other kind of creature, and not being aware, at least at first, that they were actually with a fairy or something like this. Now, with the solitary supernatural, this is absolutely impossible. You sometimes have humanoid forms or something vaguely human, but it's very clear that these beings are not truly human. Usually in folk literature and in medieval literature, where this topos is very important, the idea that we have fairies in front of us emerges as the story goes on. And a classic example of this from the Atlantic seaboard of Europe is the young man who at dawn goes down to the sea and encounters a beautiful woman bathing naked in a pond, or in a pool, excuse me, by the sea. And he's considering how this is the woman of his life. Obviously, he's been struck by this extraordinary individual before her. And at a certain point in the conversation, maybe she starts to swim in the pool, he realizes that she doesn't have legs, she has a fishtail. And this is a very common notion with the social supernatural. We have something that seems human, but often has an element that is not actually that human. Okay, a second point is the psychology of the social supernatural. If you look at the solitary supernatural in Europe, solitary supernatural beings are usually extremely simple, sometimes tediously so. In motoring terms, they have one or maybe two gears. For example, a shapeshifter changes shapes. That's it. A spirit and a water undine drowns children in her pond and devours them. That's it. It's very rare to find a supernatural being that has more to it than that in folk tradition. And the social supernatural, I think, is important because the beings there that you come across are very rich in psychological terms. And this comes across even in accounts we have in folk tradition that are often quite simple stories. These are beings that are capable of love, of hate, and they can change between these states. One of the reasons I so like fairy lore is because in psychological terms, they are the richest stories. Another thing that frequently comes up is that social supernatural beings are glimpsed in collective acts. Solitary supernatural beings walk around, they change shapes, but they don't do things normally together. Social supernatural beings are forever doing things together. The men are always riding out to hunt or to battle, or they're changing where they live. The women are collected by the riverbank and they're washing their clothes, or they're making butter, or they're weaving. Men and women together go to weddings or to funerals. In fact, I would challenge you to find anything that happens socially in a pre-industrial European agricultural community that is not mimicked in social supernatural lore. So 3 points here. A fourth one is the question of hierarchy. These beings usually have some form of hierarchy within their community, and the most obvious form of this is they have a king or a queen, but they often have more complex hierarchies too. Sometimes we have reference to warriors within the community, and sometimes we have reference to the other end of the, let's say, the social scale, and slaves and servants, some of which are human captives in their community. And so you actually have a relatively complex hierarchy. In some cases, it's rather simpler. Maybe there's a smaller group, and to use a term from British political theory, we have the first among equals. One of the group is a senior member, prima inter pares, is the person who is to some extent the leader, but not in any particular formal way. Now, of course, with the solitary supernatural, this almost by definition is entirely lacking. You simply don't get hierarchies. A fifth point are the homes of the social supernatural. Let's start with the solitary supernatural here. If you find the home of the solitary supernatural, you're often dealing with a very muddy or fetid pool. Maybe you're dealing with a small room at the top of the house where the spirit lives in a crack in the corner. Maybe there's a patch of woodland. As far as the social supernatural, you have far more dramatic locations. You have bigger locations, and these locations are usually rather charismatic. They're impressive places, the kind of places that you remember. And in fact, I'll show you a couple of pictures of such places later. They're often very vast, and there is the idea that human beings can enter them. Though to enter these places, the topos of ineffability often comes up. A human being who enters the realm of the trolls, for example, in Sweden, it's not just that they can't describe what they've experienced. Often there's the sense that they cannot process what they've experienced. It's such a strong experience. And here in European culture and European literature, our point of reference should be the third part of Dante's Divine Comedy, when Dante passes through purgatory and then meets Beatrice and starts to go into paradise. Dante can no longer describe really what he's experiencing. The final point is in many ways the most interesting, at least for me. And this is the fact that supernatural communities often are in a form of symbiotic relationship with their human neighbours. Now, contrast this with the solitary supernatural. Usually when we come across the solitary supernatural, there is the idea that in some senses, the solitary supernatural is an anomaly. Something has gone wrong in creation. Very often because of human activities, there is a spirit which is ambivalent, sometimes even evil, and the natural order has to some extent broken down. The protection that God would normally give his community is not working. There's a bug in the system, there's a wrinkle. This is not the case with the social supernatural. With the social supernatural, there seems to be this idea that this is the natural order. And that, for example, those living within a supernatural society need human beings. This is particularly commonly associated with reproduction. There is the idea that the social supernatural can breed, can have children only with human partners, or if that's not the case, they need humans to facilitate the process in some ways. And two common versions of this is that the social supernatural needs human midwives to assist in the act of birth, or they need human wet nurses to breastfeed or care for their young. There's also the notion, of course, that children are stolen from human communities, which is perhaps another version of this. But we also have the sense that often, for instance, in battles within social supernatural communities, you need one human warrior to participate in the fight. And the same goes for sporting activities. When social supernatural teams play each other, the team with a human player will inevitably win. Now, it works the other way as well. Humans need the social supernatural as well. These are usually landscape spirits. I personally don't like the term nature spirits, but they are the spirits of the landscape. And to some extent, they govern fertility. And by fertility, I don't just mean within the human community, I mean in the landscape itself. Are you going to get crops? Are you going to get harvest this year? It depends on what is happening in the social supernatural realm. And also a very important point, those that live in your community and that traffic in magic gain their magical power from the social supernatural. They have this magic because they have contacts with the social supernatural. In some cases, they claim to have lived in social supernatural communities. And in some extreme cases, they actually claim to belong to social supernatural communities. Spelt out, the version of this is, I am a fairy. I'm not a human being, and I can create these magical acts because I belong, because I have fairy blood, because I'm of that nature. Now, I've given you these 6 points here to set out what Davide Ermacora and myself decided on as useful characteristics for the social supernatural. It would be churlish, silly, perhaps even stupid to start looking at social supernatural traditions in Europe and start saying they're not right because they do not fulfill these criteria. If that were the case, then clearly the problem is with the criteria, not the folklore tradition that contains them. And what I want to do now is show you how, in fact, these criteria work incredibly well in some contexts, but much less well in other contexts. In other words, and very predictably, the situation is messy. Now, to do this, you've been very patient and you spent half an hour looking at my face. What I want to do now is turn to some images just to give you a rest and just to focus your intention. And I think, yeah, I'll probably just give 3 case studies this evening, but just to give you an idea of how these communities differ. And what I would say is that we need to think of a spectrum. We need to think of a spectrum that goes all the way from the social supernatural, the super social supernatural at one end of the scale, through the semi-social supernatural in the middle of the spectrum, and all the way, to borrow a term from American politics, to the social supernatural in name only. In other words, supernatural societies that have almost none of these 6 characteristics. And what I'd like to do now, and I hope to goodness this comes up, Adriana, can you confirm you can see this? Great. What I'd like to do is talk you through then, given the time we have, just 3 of these examples. The first of these examples is, I think, perhaps the very best instance of the super social natural. Let's start again. The super social supernatural from Europe, just in terms of the evidence and the fact that we have evidence going all the way back to the 7th century and very strong evidence up to before the Second World War. And here we are in Ireland. And I said at the beginning, it's no accident that the concept of the social supernatural as a folklore tool emerged in that country. You're looking here at a picture of Ben Bulbin. Ben Bulbin is this extraordinary mountain in County Sligo, in Connacht, close to the west coast of Ireland. It's very suitable for what we've been talking about because W.B. Yeats was buried at the foot of Ben Bulbin. And Ben Bulbin also has these very strong fairy associations. I've put up on the slide the medieval term for the Irish fairies in Gaelic, the Aishí. And in our volume, we have an excellent chapter by John Carey, actually heading up the volume. John is a very gifted Celticist at Cork University. And Ben Bulbin was associated with fairy lore. I mean, just look at this mountain. This is the definition of what I was talking about when I said charismatic sites. And there's one wonderful description of a fairy sighting on this mountain. One of our best studies of Irish fairies in the post-war period was written by an American professor. And one evening, this professor found himself in a little farmhouse at the bottom of Ben Bulbin, and it was pitch black outside, very dark. And he went out and he saw lights running up and down on the invisible slopes of Ben Bulbin, these impossibly steep slopes. Now, however we explain these in local tradition, these would have been explained as the fairies or the Sidhe. Now, Irish fairies offer a very rich range of possibilities. But I've given you this second image here. And this is a painting from Cork, where John Carey, in fact, teaches. And this is, though, from the mid-early 19th century. And I'll set you all a challenge here. There are fairies in this picture. And my question to you is, can you see the fairies? I'll explain where they are in a moment. What you actually have here is a painting. The Irish painter has tried to represent a cross-section of rural Irish life here. And so you see, particularly on the left, the poorer part of the social spectrum, and then moving towards the right, you have what in Irish agricultural life used to be called the strong farmers. These are small landowners, and then also what looks to be quite a big landowner. Now, where is the fairy? The fairy is down here. It's in this little whirlwind. In Irish tradition, these whirlwinds of dust were associated with a fairy or fairies moving across the land. And in fact, the fear that you can see in some of the faces here is precisely because we have fairies. Now, of course, a whirlwind is not very promising in terms of my categories, but when you actually came face to face with the Sidhe, they're almost always described as just being normal looking in human terms. And they also have, in many Irish stories, a very rich psychology. So here we're going through the points I talked about earlier as possible criteria for the social supernatural. There's also this strong sense of symbiosis in the community. This painting was made before the Irish potato famine, but in the late 1840s and the early 1950s, the late 1850s, there was one of the great tragedies of 19th century European history, the Irish potato famine, that killed perhaps 1 million Irish men, women, and children, and sent another million running for emigration. There's a very good chance if you're in the Americas today and you have any Irish DNA, it's thanks to the potato famine and those that were chased off the land. And the Irish in the countryside, many Irish people believed the potato famine came because of an imbalance in the fairy world, in the world of the Sidhe. And also in these communities, particularly before the potato famine, less so after, there were members of these communities who were what in Hiberno English were called fairy doctors. And these were individuals who trafficked magic with the fairies. If you had a problem with your family, with your house, with your cattle, you paid the fairy doctor, and the fairy doctor would be a kind of an intermediary between you and the world of the Sidhe. Okay, let me move now to a second example, and I'm going to talk here about the Bohyni of Ukraine. The Bohyni are a very unusual, for me anyway, social supernatural grouping because they're only women. This is a single-sex society. And in fact, there are several examples of this from Eastern Europe, and I've taken this image, which is at the edge of this tradition, and you can see behind 2 horsemen looking on in wonder at this group of women dancing. And in many parts of Eastern Europe, and including in Western Ukraine, where these traditions come from, there are these single-sex communities. Now, in our book, we have a fabulous chapter by Natalie Kononenko, who is a Ukrainian scholar based out of Canada. And Natalie has done a fantastic job of communicating this world to outsiders like myself. And I hope for my sake that I've pronounced Bohyni right, because otherwise I'm sure Natalie will have something to say about it. But going back to the 6 criteria I talked about before, we have, I think, a semi-social supernatural system here. It's not quite as totalizing as the Irish system. For example, the Bohyni are not associated with these vast special homes that we find in Irish fairy tradition. I would say there's not particularly, in the evidence I saw, symbiosis. If anything, there seems to be more a parasitical relationship. Though I know that's not true of all the old female societies in the east of Europe. I also personally found the accounts rather flatter in psychological terms. The Bohyni seem to have 2 gears. One is an erotic gear, and the other is a violent psychopathic gear. And then sometimes perhaps there's a combination, a rather unpleasant combination of the 2. I'm just going to give you another image here, and here I've also given you the spelling for Bohyni. Now, unfortunately, there are no images that I've been able to find of the Bohyni, so I'm borrowing here from similar traditions round about Ukraine. And this picture here, I find incredibly powerful and suggestive. This is a painting from Poland of a similar class of social supernatural women who live in these small communities, usually non-hierarchical. And I think you can catch something of not entirely good in their faces here. And I hope I'm going to try and move my video, but over here in the background where my cursor is, you can see a man who is presumably their next victim. And I think perhaps the most sinister part of this painting, if you go and look for it afterwards, is you can see here there is one of these young women who is in a state of undress. And if the painting went deep enough, you would see that under her there is a naked man. But the naked man is not under her body, he is under her feet. He is lying on his back, dead. And here we have this familiar sexual tradition that I particularly associate with Eastern Europe, that it's not enough for the social supernatural to have sexual relations with human beings. They suck the life out of human beings. It's an unpleasant process in this sense. And so this is a fascinating folklore system. And of course, I'm not for a second saying that there's something wrong with this system because it doesn't meet the 6 criteria I'm setting out before. I suppose by implication, what I'm saying is these criteria I gave earlier seem to work better in some places than in others. And maybe we need a slightly different model in these instances. I'm going to finish with one last case study. And this is inspired by a chapter in our book by Wilhelm de Blecourt, who's written this chapter on the Vita Viven. And these are translated into English, the White Wives. Now, what on earth are the White Wives? Well, this is a map of the Netherlands. And here you see the sites that are associated with the White Wives. And these, interestingly, are also groups, small groups of women that live together. There is no male reference in these communities. And I've given you this example because for me, this would be an example of a social supernatural grouping in name only. On paper, this is a collective, but really when you look at the folklore traditions, they're very reminiscent of the traditions I'm familiar with, both from the Netherlands and from Britain, of the solitary supernatural. There are 2 ways normally to come across the Vita Viven, and these are here, by the way, is one of Wilhelm's images that he's dug up from a 19th century publication. And I should say that Wilhelm is very passionate about this at the moment. And he's written this great chapter for us, but he's already writing further articles on the subject. He's clearly going forward with this. And this here you see, suitably enough, a white wife who's in a tree in this rather enclosed space, and she's weaving on her own in this image. And this relates to one folklore tradition from the Netherlands. However, usually there are 2 basic story types that come out. The first is the simple nighttime encounter. I, Simon, am walking through the Dutch countryside, and suddenly across the dike, I see a woman all in luminous white walking along. I've come across a white wife, horror. So this is the first story type. And of course, this is basically an encounter with the solitary supernatural. The second story type is a bit more promising. It's a story type that's familiar from communities all around the world. A group of young men get together, and one of the young men says, "I'm not frightened of the white wives." And the other young men say, "Yes, you are. Yes, you are." And in the end, the young man goes to where the white wives live, not one of these great charismatic locations as we saw in Ireland, but rather smaller. And he gets there. And at this point, he insults the white wives, and a white wife comes out to chase him. And in the Netherlandish tradition, the young man gets away, but only just. He is chased. And often at the end of the story, the white wife shouts out, "You only got away because before I left my house, I had to tie my shoelaces." This is a reference that comes up several times. Now, I can't speak with great knowledge for the Netherlands, but I can say that in Britain, whenever we have this story type, it is about the solitary and never the social supernatural. It is not a group of white wives who are chasing the young, arrogant man. It is a single white wife who leaves her sisters behind. So we do have a community, but really it's a community that in folklore terms acts like a solitary supernatural being. And so again, here we're seeing to some extent the inadequacy of this tradition I came up with. Now, I want to finish with this quotation from another scholar who very kindly contributed to our book. This is an extremely gifted young Canadian, Dorian Urich. And Dorian wrote our chapter on the West Balkans. And one thing I really liked about Dorian's chapter was at a certain point, Dorian did this very courageous thing and generalized about the European social supernatural tradition. Really, I and Davide should have done this in the introduction, but we lacked Dorian's courage. And I have to say that this quotation I'm giving you, I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I think that it's a brilliant starting place. It's one of these useful caricatures, a useful generalization to get us going. What Dorian says is that when you look at the European social supernatural, it breaks down, generally speaking, into three parts. The first part is, let's see if I can quote him a bit. You have the fairies in northwestern Europe who dwell in mounds, party in human homes, and are noted for living in a realm that distorts time. I think this corresponds very well to what I call the super social supernatural. And this is something that in Western Europe, you find all the way, not quite from the Pyrenees, but almost from the Pyrenees, all the way up, all the way to Iceland in the far north, and including most of France, insular communities, Scandinavia. Dorian's second category reads like this. We have an Eastern European zone running from Russia to Greece. And it's interesting that Greece is included in this. It's an Orthodox community, if you like. These are dancing, dangerous aquatic maidens like the Rusalka who bring fertility to crops. Now, you can always start to pick at these generalizations. For instance, in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, there are two important exceptions, and these are the social supernatural traditions of Romania and Hungary, which of course are the non-Slavic countries in the East. And I suppose we should also add Estonia to that list. But again, as a generalization, it's true. Though note the way that we have the white wives in the Netherlands as well. So we've got a useful generalization here, but there are these lots of exceptions. And as always in these cases, we have to decide whether there are more exceptions than rules. And then Dorian's final point, we have the southern zone, what he calls the Mediterranean zone. This produces predominantly nature spirits built in mosaic and bricolage from the fragmentary tessera of the classical world. Dorian's a great writer. Nymphs, satyrs, harpies, sirens, the goddess Diana, and other figures whose depictions have been blended, mixed, and matched over the centuries. I'm not absolutely sure what this sentence means, in the sense that this seems to be more really a miscellany of different elements. And my knowledge of this zone is that this is more or less right. It's much more difficult, actually, to generalize about the Mediterranean. And having now sent this manuscript in, my personal great frustration is that I think we did a really great job with this book, but perhaps where we failed the most was with the Mediterranean zone. We have a great chapter by Manuel Pedrosa on Iberia, but we really should have found a way to include a chapter on Sicily, where you have, for example, the tradition of Le Donne di Fuera. And here you have a series of female fairies, in inverted commas, that really conform neither to the Eastern model nor to the Western model. It's just a different system. And personally, I wish we'd done rather more with that. I'm going to finish now with this slide. And on this slide, I've written up the title of the book that hopefully will come out later this year. And if you're watching this on YouTube in 2024. I hope very much it will be at a publisher or online and there for purchase. Remember, the title may have changed a little bit by then, but maybe look for my name and Davide's surname, Ermakora, and you will find it. And this will probably be the third book in the series of Exeter New Approaches to Legend, Folklore, and Popular Belief. And we very much hope that the fourth volume will be a volume by John Clarke, a London scholar on a medieval British fairy tradition, The Green Children, and very possibly the fifth book will be a work looking at paganism, though there we haven't got approval, so I have to be a bit more cautious. What I want to finish with is just to say that we hope this series goes on and that we're very ambitious to get views from elsewhere. I have personally dreamt about doing this book on the European social supernatural for many years, but I would be very, very happy if other people could take up the challenge of looking at these social supernatural traditions elsewhere. And I've given a title, an invented title clearly, The Exeter Companion to Fairies and Other Social Supernatural Beings, American Traditions. And my image of this would be a book with between 10 and 20 scholars looking at social supernatural traditions from Tierra del Fuego in the south, all the way up to Alaska in the north. And of course, the great thing about American folklore traditions, looking not just at indigenous traditions, but at European, African, and more recent Asian traditions, and how these have come together, how these have cross-fertilized and created these fascinating traditional worlds. So if you're watching this now and this is something that might interest you, or if you're looking at this on video in the future and you think you have what it takes to pull off a volume and bring in 10 or 20 really first-class stories, first-class scholars from the Hispanic, from the Portuguese, perhaps from the Native American Indian, from the European traditions in the north of America, this would be outstanding. And with this, guys, I'm afraid I've gone to 50 minutes. I'd meant to be a bit briefer, but I'll hand back now to Adriana. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Simon. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. We have plenty of time, don't worry. And well, that's certainly a challenge we would like to take you up on, and maybe someday. It's certainly America, it's a big challenge. So you know, we're gonna start collecting those scholars. If anyone wants to sign up, here's the place. All right. So we're gonna start with the questions. We have a few questions from our audience. So within the social supernatural and the solitary supernatural characters, where would you put, for example, groups of devils, let's say, or maybe, am I going to say duendes? And you see, the word for me, duende, it's very hard to translate into English, because I believe, as we understand duende in Latin America, in English, you have brownies. I believe it will be the closest to what we understand as duendes, but of course, this is a wide character. For me, it's actually quite passionate subject, because it's a bit like fairies, because it encompasses and comprehends a wide range of characters, which I believe will be, elves wouldn't be the word. So I'm going to go with brownies. So where would they fit within the social supernatural?
Well, I think you just have to look at these traditions on their merits. Now, in the folklore systems I know best in Western Europe, I want to be careful before I say never, because I always regret this afterwards. But I don't think really you have traditions of devils gathering together. You have lots and lots of traditions where devils or demons appear, but they're almost always solitary. You do have examples where what looks, for example, in Britain, very much like fairy traditions, are described as devils by ecclesiastical writers. But for me, this is just a problem of definition. However, I personally, I don't care about the name. What I mean by that is, if you came across a tradition where a group of devils had a community together and they lived together on this earth, because clearly there's the hierarchy of hell. But if they lived together on this earth, then I wouldn't hesitate to refer to them as the social supernatural. I think another interesting thing that you can bring out is that very often people encounter the social supernatural alone. So in other words, they meet one representative of the social supernatural. Think of the example I gave you of the man going down to the beach and finding this beautiful young woman. Yet usually in the encounter, the woman's world behind her starts to become an issue. She may be on her own, but she represents a larger community, and this becomes part of the story. And my experience in British folklore is that when you meet devils and demons, they don't really represent a larger community behind them. Maybe they're evil, maybe they're imbecilic, but they belong in the tradition I know best very much to the social supernatural. However, again, I wouldn't hesitate for a moment in calling them the social supernatural if there was this idea of devils dwelling together in a society. Now, with duendes, I think it's probably best if I just don't go there, because my encounters with duendes tradition, to be honest, Adriana, I'm a little bit confused by what's involved, because it's a word that seems to mean different things in different places. But with what you call brownies, I mean, brownies are never found in groups. They're solitary beings. And so, but I think there is an interesting point, though, here, that these house-dwelling spirits, there are occasional examples, and Dorian, in fact, in the quotation alluded to this, there are occasional examples where household spirits are collective. For example, if you did a map of Britain, there are 3 English counties where that happens, and they're in the southwest. So it's something that's sometimes a factor, and I think that this is one of the areas where things again get messy.
Definitely. It is quite an interesting point, to go into the duendes, and I agree that they're hard to define because they change quite a lot between region. Like you say, parish by parish, they change quite a lot. We also have
Adriana, sorry, I can't resist. But at the very dawn of British and Irish folklore writing, Thomas Crofton Croker writes his 3 great volumes on Irish supernatural lore, and he includes there. Thomas Crofton Croker was a terrible show-off, and in one of the stories on the and house spirits that are actually very rare in Ireland, he includes a long poem in Spanish about duendes. So they enter in a weird way British tradition there.
That's brilliant. I have to look that up. Thank you. So we have 2 comments by Mark Norman on Facebook. Mark says, in supernatural stories, I will argue women will normally be spinning while weavers are normally male. And he also mentions that Morgan Daimler, I'm sorry about my pronunciation, Daimler, has done good work carry on where Catherine Briggs left off with the dictionary definitions.
Yeah. Well, it's great I didn't realize Mark would be here tonight. Mark, I'm full of admiration that you're awake at midnight in the UK, well, almost 1 a.m. Yeah, sorry, I may well have misused a term there, and I take your point. I think that Morgan absolutely has taken up the challenge that Catherine Briggs left, and I suppose that Morgan, I'm a big fan of Morgan's writing, and it is true that she's taken this fairy dictionary model forward. I think that for me, it's important, though, to be a little bit careful with terms. And this is perhaps the great challenge that we face in supernatural folklore at the moment, to try and understand these folk taxonomies. And the problem is that when we come in as outsiders, as I do when I talk about the Bohyni or other groups, there's the real danger that we don't know the local realities. Now, of course, that didn't apply to Catherine Briggs, and it certainly doesn't apply to Morgan. But I think that this is one of the problems with the fairy dictionary approach. So in other words, it works, but you have to be very careful. You need people like Morgan or Catherine Briggs to make it work.
Of course, of course. Next question would be, could you tell us a little bit more about the cases where humans are forced to take part, let's say, in parties and drinking with fairies, and within this, also within the social supernatural, where would you locate witches, let's say, because they also gather and they work in groups and communities?
Okay, well, I'm much more comfortable with the first question than the second. The second one is the kind of question that chills my blood.
Sorry.
So with the first question, I mean, you say that humans are obliged to eat or drink. Certainly in what I would refer to as the super social, supernatural parts of Europe. Dorian's first category in that quotation I gave you. I would say it's more that they're tempted to eat fairy food or take part. They're brought into the fairy world, but there is the idea that they can leave, and that changes. And our great British folklorist Jeremy Hart sums this very well. Jeremy says that there are two things you must never do if you stumble into the world of fairy. You never dance and you never eat or drink. Because if you do either of those two things, it is over. This is what the Americans would say would be a rookie's mistake. So if you ever find yourself in the fairy realms, do not eat, do not drink, and do not dance. So again, perhaps we could say they're tricked into doing it, but I'm not sure it's right to say they're forced into doing it. And of course, lots of folk stories about human beings escaping from the bounds of fairies because they realize this problem. Right, as far as witches go, the problem is that in English, witch really has two different meanings. The typical meaning of witch is a human magical practitioner. But in some traditions, in the English-speaking world as well, witch can mean actually a supernatural non-human being. And the synonym, which is often used in English, is hag. And of course, this is something that's found in world folklore systems where you have these scary female figures, the Strix, for example, in classical supernatural systems, something that I associate with Italy. And so if you're talking about the first category, I think the major thing that witches fit in with is that these are magical practitioners, and if they live in areas where the social supernatural is dominant, they will often claim to have their magic powers from the fairies, and so that's their place in the ecology of these systems. And this is, for instance, the case with Ireland, that if you're a magical practitioner in the community, a witch, though actually in Ireland this wasn't the term that would have been typically used, then it's the fairies that give you your power. And when you're trying to convince someone to commission you, to pay you, it's because you are able to convince them that you have these special relations with the fairies. I think that you also get then into a really richer field where, to be honest, I prefer not to go because I feel I just don't know enough about it. But the whole tradition of magical practitioners coming together and meeting in these bacchalic feasts and parties. And here we have the witches' Sabbat and these ideas here that are also intimately connected with the social supernatural. But I've never really understood, and here I'm limited by my British background, how much of this is scholarly invention and how much of this is really rooted in tradition, as it seems to be in parts of Eastern Europe, I acknowledge.
Thank you. I'm so sorry about my pronunciation here. It says, thanks, Simon, for your enchanting lecture. I cannot but wonder what kind of fairy drink are you sipping, though. I was wondering that too. And
listen, I'll just answer that straight away. I have a long tradition that when I do these lectures, I always drink ginger beer. And I can tell you, if I ever do a lecture again at 1 o'clock in the morning, I will definitely get lots of ginger beer. And the great thing about ginger beer, for those of you who don't know, is it's non-alcoholic, but it peps you up. If the fairies drink non-alcoholic beer, they drink ginger beer. It's an absolutely fantastic stuff. And one of my great struggles with living in Italy is getting a ginger beer supply because the Italians don't like it.
I'm not sure we can get it here either, but I'm definitely gonna look it up now. Thank you. All right, so let's go we have 3 more questions, Simon, is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. All right, so Ernesto Sanchez, he says, there are stories where a supernatural society is harassed by a particular individual being or the other way around, that they chase each other or they hunt a supernatural being. How would that, have you encountered any type of these stories where a community supernatural being harass another society or the other way around?
So this is a war between the human and the social supernatural society, or it's a war between 2 supernatural societies?
I believe between, I understand that between a supernatural society by an individual, let's say, or the other way around, a community of humans harassed by a supernatural figure.
I mean, you certainly have you certainly have these examples where a figure, the social supernatural harasses individuals in human society. But I can't think of examples the other way around. The only one that comes slightly to mind is there are some weird German traditions, but again, this isn't an area of which I'm a specialist, but there are some unusual German traditions about the wild hunt. The wild hunt is this idea that you have some kind of charismatic, magnetic, but evil leader, or maybe a devil figure, sometimes a pagan god, who leads a hunt of evil figures through the forests or through the sky. And in some traditions in Germany, I think I'm right in saying that the wild hunt goes after social supernatural beings. And that the one example I'm thinking of is there are the so-called moss wives in Germany that are another of these single-sex communities. And I think there are stories about the wild hunt chasing members of this community, but perhaps that's not quite what you're talking about there. So sorry if I've not answered the question properly.
Ernesto just commented, thank you, and just to correct me, basically, if certain societies chase an individual supernatural being.
So human societies?
Human societies chasing a supernatural individual.
No, I mean, certainly in the traditions I know, I can't think of that. I mean, the only examples, but this isn't what you're looking for at all. In 19th century Britain, there is a sociological phenomena. If there is a solitary supernatural being in a given place, sometimes the local community decides to hunt the solitary supernatural being. But that's almost always because the local community is convinced, very often correctly, that it's someone pretending to be a supernatural being. And if you're interested in that, the best examples from 19th century Britain are perhaps the legends around Spring-Heeled Jack, who is a kind of a supernatural character who was often chased through the streets by crowds. And we know from Victorian newspapers, these crowds were sometimes in their thousands.
Of course, of course. The next question by Vladimir Atahualpa. He says, thank you for an interesting lecture. From your perspective, why are these supernatural beings so simple in their forms? I'm not sure. That will be simple, quite simple. Maybe just referring to the sense that sometimes solitary supernatural are more simple and the social supernatural are quite more complex.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't really talk about simple or complex in this context. I would think of it more like a spectrum of how human they are, how much they look like humans. And my co-editor Davide always reminds me that there's this very strong tradition that even when a social supernatural being is very human, that there's always some what we would call in English a tail. You know, the classic thing is that perhaps they have a tail, or if you look under the woman's dress, you see that she doesn't have feet, but she has hooves. There's some little giveaway sign, and sometimes quite a big sign. And then as far as the solitary supernatural goes, I suppose it's important that there's always this vague relationship to humanity, or if not to humanity, perhaps to animals that humans are familiar with. But of course, they're not quite the same. And very often these forms are shifting. They can't even settle on one form. And this is something always wonderfully disturbing, I think, in supernatural tales.
Of course. And I believe this will be our last question by Lau Ubita. What does folklore say about fairy magic or the different types of magic that fairies have?
Okay, well, there are different traditions of magic in Europe associated with fairies, but particularly in that first category of what I've called the super social supernatural, many of these communities have a type of magic called glamour. And glamour is the idea that you can create illusions. And there are many encounters with the social supernatural where I'll give you a very common example from Britain and parts of Germanic Europe and Scandinavia too, where someone is out walking at night and they're shocked to see in the field, in the middle of nowhere, a market. And they go to the market and they look around, and there are all these humans shopping at this market in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. Now, of course, the reader knows immediately that this is the social supernatural, but the person who's caught up in this doesn't necessarily. And very often there comes a moment in the story where this person does something that breaks the spell, that they lose the illusion, that there is this illusion that's been cast by this social supernatural community, but maybe the person inadvertently speaks or says the name of God, or does something that breaks the magic. And it's always a really exciting moment in folklore tradition, because what happens at that point is that these beings, at this point, everything is transformed back to its natural state. And for example, in many of these market stories, there was a group of 20 pigs, but when the spell disappears, there are just 20 insects crawling around the floor, this kind of thing. And so this is one of the major magic traditions. There is also many of these malefic magical traditions. And these include they're particularly associated across large parts of northwestern Europe, and then intermittently in other parts of Europe, with the tradition of arrows, invisible arrows that the social supernatural shoot at their victims, who are typically cattle or human beings. And you know that these have been shot at you because they're associated with prehistoric flint arrowheads. So if you're in the field and you bend over and you see a flint arrowhead, it means that the fairies are shooting at you and you might be in serious trouble. So there are a couple of examples of magical traditions. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Simon. I believe that's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. We would love to keep chatting. If it's okay, we have a few more questions. Maybe I can send them over to you so we can answer them later. And well, we want to thank you so much for accepting this talk today, for staying up for us. I know it's already tomorrow where you are, so it was lovely to listen to you. And I'm going to switch to Spanish now. Muchas gracias a todos los que nos vieron esta noche. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Queremos invitarlos, por supuesto, a la siguiente sesión del Seminario de Tradición Sobrenatural, que hablará sobre grifos gigantes y dragones, monstruos y seres sobrenaturales en las crónicas franciscanas novohispanas, que estará a cargo de Ángela Fernández el 15 de junio. Muchísimas gracias a todos los que sintonizaron. Thank you, Simon, so much. Y nos vemos para la próxima. Buenas noches.